Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Proving Diversity in Clinical Research, the Ethical, Scientific, and Financial Impact, presented by RO. I'm Michael Joshua, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Yael Sims, Integrated Product Development Associate at RO, and Jack Modell, Vice President and Senior Medical Officer at RO. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of the screen. Okay, now let's begin.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for calling in today. My name is Yael Sims, and I am a scientist in the Regulatory Strategy and Submissions Group at RO. And today I'll be presenting a talk called, as Michael mentioned, Improving Diversity in Clinical Research, the Ethical, Scientific, and Financial Impact. This is a topic that the more I learned about it, the more I knew things had to change. This talk is a result of almost a year of reviewing the scientific literature, FDA documents, news outlets, and reflecting on our own experiences at RO. RO has been completely supportive of this effort, and I am excited to share what we've learned. Our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jack Modell, who has been an influential advocate in this effort, is here today, and he will be available to answer your questions at the end of the presentation, as well as myself. So in this presentation, I will talk to you about who is participating in clinical trials and why. I'll discuss why racial and ethnic diversity is important in clinical trials and offer some solutions on what sponsors, contract research organizations, and investigators and clinical sites can do to increase diversity. I wanted to start this presentation by telling you about two women who have considered participating in clinical trials and their stories. This is Rolitha, who is a close family friend of one of my colleagues at RO. Rolitha is an African-American woman who participated in a clinical trial for fertility issues in the 1990s when she was in her 20s. She was initially hesitant to participate in a clinical trial because few clinicians looked like her, so she felt like she didn't belong. Rolitha believes that clinical trials were only for white people and not for people of color. After careful consideration and talking with her husband, she decided to participate in a clinical trial because of the ability to be a catalyst for change in the African American community. She also believed the benefits outweighed the risk, but the reason she saw the clinical trial through to the end was because of the relationships she built with the clinicians and staff. They made her feel like she did belong. After the study, Rolitha gave birth to a healthy baby girl. And she said that she would participate in another clinical trial in the future if the experience was as personal and meaningful as the first. In contrast to Rolitha's story, Pat is a 72-year-old African-American woman with relapsed multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer. She had been on 2 drug regimens that unfortunately did not halt her cancer. She was eligible for a clinical trial for multiple myeloma treatment, but she was worried about the burden of regular hour-long trips from her home to the trial site and co-pays for medical tests. She was quoted in a news article as saying, "They'll want a new biopsy, and biopsies are not cheap." So even though Pat did not participate in a clinical trial, she said she would have if it wasn't such a burden because she wanted something positive to come from her illness. She was quoted as saying, "If they don't have African Americans to test it on, how will they know it's going to work? If it doesn't help me, it'll help my children. It'll help somebody else." So at the time that Pat was considering participating in a clinical trial for multiple myeloma treatment, the Ninlaro Trial was going on. And Ninlaro is a now FDA-approved pill for multiple myeloma that had gained patients an average of 6 months without their cancer spreading. And African Americans are more than twice as likely as white Americans to be diagnosed with the blood cancer. but only 1.8%, just 13 out of 722 participants in this trial were African American. In trials for 24 of the 31 cancer drugs approved since 2015, less than 5% of the patients were African American, and this foreshadows the purpose of this talk. But before we get into more detail about who is participating in clinical trials, I think it's important for us to understand why patients participate in clinical trials. So some patients want to learn about their condition, especially if they have a rare disease that their regular provider may not be very familiar with treating. Patients want to access new cutting-edge treatment options. Some of the most exciting science out there is happening in clinical trials. It's often, even in the first phase of clinical testing, where we make sure a drug is safe, 20% of cancer patients see their tumors shrink or disappear. So this is often a last resort for serious or life-threatening conditions, and people want to receive the highest standard of care, which is always the case in clinical trials, in the control especially. Some people participate because of financial compensation and participation incentives. Some people participate to gain access to health care that they might not have already had access to. And others, like Pat and Rolitha, were really motivated to help others with their condition and advance medical science. So who is currently participating in clinical trials? This is a snapshot of the FDA Drug Trial Snapshot Program, which is an annual report that provides information about who participated in clinical trials that supported FDA approval of new drugs. So in 2018, overall, 69% of clinical trial participants were white, 11% were Black or African American, 10% were Asian, and 14% were Hispanic. And you can see the graph below is the overall U.S. population broken down by demographics. You see that overall clinical trial participation slightly skews white compared with the overall U.S. population. However, this aggregate is misleading, as you'll soon see, because minority participation in clinical trials varies widely by trial. So when we look at infectious disease approvals, this is the first page of all of infectious disease approvals in 2018. On the left-hand column, you can see the drug name, the indication, and then breakdown by demographic groups. You can see that there are some trials with high minority participation in this therapeutic area, particularly in HIV and malaria. Overall, 23% of infectious disease clinical trial subjects were Black in 2018, 17% were Hispanic, and 10% were Asian. However, we see a different picture when we look at oncology approvals. This is just the first page of oncology approvals in 2018. You can see that there are much lower rates of minority participation. So overall, 4% of oncology subjects were Black, 4% Hispanic, and 15% Asian. And that 15% Asian number is also a little misleading because there were some studies, as you can see in just this first page, there were some studies with 3% Asian, less than 1%, 2%. There just happened to be some studies with 77% Asian, and that really drove up that average. It's a similar case in neurology approvals in 2018, and these are things like migraine, seizure. Overall, 7% of neurology clinical trial participants were Black, 12% were Hispanic, and 6% were Asian. I do also want to point out that the FDA snapshot does not include data on Native Americans or Alaska Natives, who together make up about 2% of the U.S. population. So the take-home message here is that many current clinical trial populations do not reflect the true demographics and disease prevalence in the U.S., and by 2050, more than 50% of the U.S. population is projected to be other than non-Hispanic white. So it will become even more important to make clinical trials more ethnically and racially diverse. So why is diversity in clinical trials important? Well, there are known health disparities in outcomes by race and ethnicity, and I'm just going to list a few of them. There are a lot that we just can't cover in one presentation. So African Americans are more likely to get blood cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, and prostate cancer than white Americans. African Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to die from prostate cancer and twice as likely as white Americans to die prematurely from stroke. Native Americans are twice as likely to be diagnosed with diabetes as white Americans, and Native American women have higher rates of stroke-related deaths than Hispanic and white women. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are twice as likely to be diagnosed with stomach cancer and liver cancer as white Americans. And Hispanic Latino Americans are twice as likely as white non-Hispanic Americans to be diagnosed with diabetes and 3 to 4 times as likely to acquire HIV/AIDS compared to non-Hispanic Americans. It's also important to note that Hispanic and African American adults are less likely to have health insurance than white adults. And this is important for clinical trial participation, as you'll later see. So why else is diversity in clinical trials important? Well, there are known differences in responses to medical products observed in people of color. Meta-analysis found that 1 in 5 new FDA-approved drugs demonstrate some difference in exposure and response across racial and ethnic groups. For example, ACE inhibitors, which is a hypertension treatment, are less effective in African Americans, and current guidelines and labeling recommend alternative therapies for African Americans because it's believed that hypertension follows a different disease pathway in this group. There are warning and precautions for carbamazepine, which is a treatment for nerve pain, seizures, bipolar disorder, because the incidence of adverse events is higher in Asians as compared to other groups. And for the drug isosorbide dinitrate hydralazine, which is a heart failure treatment, this shows improved survival for African Americans, but not whites. So we could be missing a therapy that only works in some racial subgroups if drugs aren't tested in those subgroups. And in the U.S., Puerto Rican and African American children who have the highest prevalence of asthma nationwide respond least well to life-saving medications like albuterol, and this may contribute to the 4 to 5-fold higher rate of death from asthma among these groups compared to white Americans. So what are the reasons for these population differences? Well, there are intrinsic factors like different genes, metabolism, elimination, and also extrinsic factors like different diet, environmental exposure, and sociocultural issues like institutionalized racism, which plays a huge part in this. There's likely an interaction between these factors. The take-home message here, though, is that people of color may experience unanticipated side effects and lack of efficacy after drug approval if they're not included in clinical trials. And this could exacerbate the huge health disparities by race and ethnicity that already exist. So what does the FDA think about all of this? Well, the FDA expects sponsors to enroll study participants who reflect the demographics of clinically relevant populations for their product with regards to age, sex, race, and ethnicity. Section 907 of the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, also called FDASIA in 2012, directed the FDA to investigate how well demographic subgroups are included in clinical trials and if subgroup-specific safety and effectiveness data are available in applications for medical products. In 2014, FDA came out with an action plan to enhance the collection and availability of demographic subgroup data. And this action plan had 3 priorities. One was to improve the completeness and quality of demographic subgroup data, because before 2014, we did not have data on demographic subgroups in drug development, at least publicly. 2 was to identify barriers to subgroup enrollment in clinical trials and employ strategies to encourage greater participation. And 3, to make demographic subgroup data more available and transparent. And that FDA drug trial snapshot program that I showed you earlier is one of those efforts to make data more available and transparent. In June, FDA came out with a draft guidance for industry on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. And I'll talk about some of the ideas they present there later in this talk. In short, FDA cares about diversity in clinical trials, and we like to keep FDA happy. So why else is diversity in clinical trials important? Well, it's good science. Marginalized populations would gain access to cutting-edge therapies, which will allow researchers to identify subtypes of disease and develop targeted treatments. This is especially relevant in oncology care, which is becoming more targeted toward tumor types and genes. You can also recruit the population of interest more quickly and easily. Excuse me. If you're developing a drug, let's say for asthma, and you know that African Americans are more likely to have asthma than other groups, If you are thoughtful about the way you recruit African Americans, you will recruit people who have the disease. It's also an upfront investment on growing community ties that can be drawn on for other indications in the future. If you know about your treatment population, you can treat them better. Understanding their needs will help you sell it better too if you're a drug company. You'll be able to develop more relevant advertisements because the patient who would be taking your product would have been involved from the beginning. It can also lead to positive PR. People want to know that drug companies care about them and aren't just trying to make, as much money as possible. And at Roe, this aligns with our corporate values. Our purpose is to heal the world through research excellence. We can't do that if only some people are benefiting from the science. This is personally meaningful to us, and we've made it a corporate priority. I do also want to acknowledge that there are other marginalized groups, such as pregnant women, the elderly, low-income populations, people of non-cisgender sexual orientation, who also need more representation and data in clinical trials. But that's not the focus of this presentation today. So why are racial and ethnic minorities not participating in clinical trials to the same extent as white patients? Well, there is less awareness about and access to clinical trials. People of color are more likely to have other comorbid conditions like hypertension and diabetes, which can complicate research findings, and trials often want to enroll the healthiest sick people they can find. Native Americans face cultural barriers and geographic isolation, especially within reservations and tribal groups. There's also a lack of direct recruitment due to bias. People of color are just not being asked as often as white patients if they want to participate. There's also the financial, transportation, and childcare burden that Pat alluded to in the earlier example. So while the experimental drug used in a study is free, any already approved treatments that are part of the trial typically need to be covered by that patient's own insurance. And the cost of scans and biopsies are sometimes not covered by a trial, which can exclude a lot of people who don't have good insurance, which, as I mentioned earlier, tends to be people of color. There are also language barriers and health literacy issues, and misunderstandings and misinformation about clinical research. So some people who know anything about clinical research are afraid about getting a placebo, but in oncology studies, there's usually not a placebo. The control group is typically the standard of care. And this is something that can be easily, clarified once you get to talk to people. So why else are racial ethnic minorities not participating in clinical trials? Well, there's a lack of representative providers. As Ralitha mentioned, no one in the clinic looked like her, so she didn't feel comfortable. This is a real concern. There's also the U.S. history of medical exploitation of African Americans and Native Americans. There's a Tuskegee syphilis study. Excuse me. In 1932, African-American men were promised free treatment for bad blood. They were not told that they were going to be studied in a government-run experiment on the progression of untreated syphilis. The study never obtained informed consent from the men, and even after penicillin was discovered and used as a treatment for syphilis in 1945, the men in the Tuskegee study were not offered the antibiotic, and in some cases, staff made sure the men did not receive treatment. The study lasted for 40 years, until 1972, which isn't that long ago. There's also the story of Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells, which many of you might be familiar with. Henrietta Lacks was a young mother in 1951 when she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for bleeding. Doctors there discovered a malignant tumor on her cervix and collected cells from the tumor without her knowledge or consent. These cells were able to live outside of the human body longer than any cells at the time, and they led to the development of significant medical advancements, including vaccines, cancer treatments, and in vitro fertilization. There are over 17,000 patents that involve HeLa cells. The Lacks family have not received profits gained from research that use these cells. And then there's the story of the example of the diabetes project with the Havasupai tribe. In 1989, researchers from Arizona State University embarked on a research study with the Havasupai tribe. This community lives in the remote part of the Grand Canyon and has high rates of type 2 diabetes. The diabetes project included testing blood samples to search for links between genes and diabetes risk. At the time of consent, tribe members were told that the samples would be used specifically for genetic studies on diabetes. The researchers were not successful in finding a genetic link to diabetes. So they then used the blood samples for other unrelated studies, such as on schizophrenia, migration, and inbreeding, all of which are taboo topics for the Havasupai. In 2004, the Havasupai tribe filed a lawsuit against ASU researchers for misuse of the DNA samples. The lawsuit articulated concerns about lack of informed consent, violation of civil rights through mishandling of blood samples, unapproved use of data, and violation of medical confidentiality. So in all three of these examples, it just shows that the importance of informed consent in building trust in communities. So now on to the solutions. What can sponsors, CROs, and investigators and sites do to increase diversity in clinical trials? If you're a sponsor, you can do market research on the disease experience, language, misconceptions, and patient preferences. An example is market research that Pfizer, a sickle cell disease product. Pfizer hired an ethnographer to understand both what a sickle cell attack was like and how to change the company's approach to enrollment into their rivipansel trial. The ethnographer found that Pfizer and patients weren't even speaking the same language. Pfizer was calling these attacks by their medical name, vaso-occlusive crisis, but patients were calling it a pain crisis. They were in pain, and they didn't know what a vaso-occlusive crisis was. I'm a scientist, and I didn't know what a vaso-occlusive crisis was. Pfizer also learned that it shouldn't be approaching patients about the trial during the pain crisis when they were in terrible pain, but rather when they were stable and through a trusted doctor. The last phase 2 trial for rivipansel had taken 3 years to enroll 75 people. The upcoming phase 3 trial needed to enroll 5 times as many patients. The study is still enrolling, but it's on track to finish in 3 years. So this is an example where market research paid off. Sponsors can also emphasize the importance of diversity with CROs and investigators. If a sponsor tells us something is important to them, it's important to us too. Sponsors can address and provide resources for the financial, transportation, and childcare burden that subjects experience. Sponsors can translate consent forms into the language of the subject population, even if not required to do so by the IRB. They can offer support for flexible clinic hours and partner with patient advocacy groups to educate patients. And the FDA draft guidance on enhancing diversity in clinical trial populations urges sponsors to make recruitment events accessible by holding them often and offering them during evenings and weekends in non-clinical settings like places of worship or barbershops. So if you are a CRO like Roe, and CROs are often hired to conduct clinical trials on behalf of sponsors, what can we do to increase diversity? Well, we can plan for diversity early during protocol development and talks with the sponsor. Whenever I get a proposal to review, I immediately look up the incidence and prevalence of the disease by racial and ethnic subgroups. I look to see if certain groups are dying at higher rates. And this shows our sponsors that we understand the burden of the disease and the population that will most benefit from their product. We also look, are there any unnecessary inclusion and exclusion criteria, like comorbid conditions, that might unnecessarily exclude minority participants? It's also important to choose clinical sites where diverse populations live and which have demonstrated the past ability to recruit diverse patients. Consider choosing sites near historically Black colleges and universities, such as in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. You can use publicly available census maps to understand demographics by zip code. It's also important to select sites with diverse investigators and staff. So several years ago, our company was conducting a public health study in pediatric asthma in largely African American and Latino communities. Several of our sites were performing well and meeting our targets for subject recruitment and retention, but one site in particular was underperforming. This site had considerably lower overall enrollment, and they were struggling to retain their subjects. So many were dropping out before completing the study. We couldn't figure out why because we knew this site had a large patient population at their hospital that appeared to meet our inclusion criteria. Ultimately, we realized that the sites that were performing well all had staff who were of the same racial and ethnic background as the patients. But the site underperforming had an entirely white staff with no native Spanish speakers. This site had a much harder time building trust with their subjects. And the demographics of their trial population were also skewed more toward white subjects than the other sites. I want to be clear that this wasn't for lack of care or effort. They were working hard and trying to build rapport with the participants, but they lacked that common bond and trust. The team was able to borrow some of the native Spanish-speaking staff from another study being conducted at the same site to help reconnect with some of the Spanish-speaking participants they had lost contact with. There's no way to prove it, but we feel pretty sure that that helped prevent dropout and loss to follow-up for some of these participants. The greater long-term impact, though, was to realize that each of the study teams needed to have diverse trial staff. And an outcome that came out of this is that the site PI rebalanced his study teams to have better ethnic and racial representation on new studies. So that was an important lesson learned for us. So if you're a CRO, you can also write informed consent forms for appropriate health literacy using the terms patients do. You want to ensure adequate training of study staff at sites. The person going over the consent form with the patient should have a deep understanding of the consent form and the study so that patients can ask questions. This person should also understand that consent might not happen right away, and that's okay because sometimes people need time to really think it through if they want to participate. We can coach sites on successful recruiting strategies and facilitate knowledge sharing between sites and ask about the patient population during site identification and feasibility efforts. We can also let subjects know about study results at regular intervals. If we invest in knowledge of the patient population, it will help us win more business in that area in the future. And it really is a good idea to make patients an active partner rather than a passive participant in this process. So if you're an investigator or site, what can you do to increase diversity? Well, you can increase medical provider awareness of biases that prevent minority populations from participating. Medical mistrust exists, it certainly does, but that doesn't mean that people of color don't want to participate or don't even want to hear about a clinical trial. Building trust is essential. And to do that, you need good patient-provider communication, using the medical terms patients use, no jargon or acronyms. You want to reinforce that the priority is the patient's health and safety, saying things like your health will be closely monitored. For non-English speaking patients, you want to clarify that immigration status will not be documented. And it's important to read the situation and adapt to patient body language. Do they look like they're in pain? If they do, ask them if there's another time that would work better for them to go over the study. A friend of mine is a clinical trial lead at a cancer center in North Carolina. She was going over the consent form for a multiple myeloma study with an African-American patient who was not responding well to his current treatment. As she was going over the consent form with him, she realized that he was slouching and his color looked flush. She stopped going over the consent and told him, "You don't look good." She insisted on taking his temperature, and he had a high fever, which is really dangerous for someone going through cancer treatment. She told him he needed to go to the ER immediately, but he wanted to hear about the study because it was his last hope, and he didn't want to burden anyone or pay an ER copay. My friend didn't take no for an answer and walked him to the ER herself. It turns out he had sepsis. He likely would have died if he had gone home like he wanted to. Fortunately, he recovered from sepsis and came back to the clinic to go over the consent process when he was in the right mind to do so. He ended up participating in the trial, and he's currently in remission. I get chills every time I think of that story. It just shows the importance of reading the situation, making sure patients are able to fully consent. This is also a great example of why it's important to have patient advocates like my friend. So if you're an investigator in site, you can also give patients multiple opportunities to ask questions, saying things like, "We are here to answer your questions and listen to your concerns every step of the way." Consider offering them an informational booklet with frequently asked questions because knowledge is power. Also offer to include family members or friends in the decision-making process because this, again, helps foster trust. And let patients know that their participation is valued. Patients want to know that their participation could help others like them. So what else can you do? Turns out there's a lot. You can use technology like smartphones for screening and assessment to make it less burdensome to participate. You can recruit for staff in racially and ethnically diverse areas, and there are actually companies you can hire to help you do this, because even the wording of job postings can affect whether people of color apply. You can use radio advertisements to reach more people as compared with office flyers, and allow caretakers to sign informed consent forms on behalf of non-English speaking patients, and offer flexible clinic hours such as evenings and weekends. You can also partner with local community groups like churches to connect with the patient population and build trust. Something you can do is host a clinical trial community engagement night, which includes both patients who are former participants in clinical trials and the researchers to go over any misconceptions and the goals of clinical research. It's actually ideal to educate patients about clinical research before they even qualify for a study, when you can help reduce stigma and make them more receptive when they do qualify. If you were diagnosed with a life-threatening disease like cancer, do you think you would want to hear about a new field, a new industry of clinical research? That may not be the best time for new information because it's an overwhelming time for most everyone. You can also use patient navigators, also known as patient advocates, who are people who formally or informally provide personalized guidance to patients as they move through the healthcare system. Navigators can be employed by community groups, hospitals, or insurance companies, and they may be paid by those organizations or may be volunteers. A lot of patients want to give back to the patient community. And patient navigators can facilitate communication between providers, facilitate access to care, provide patient education and support, and educate providers about cultural differences that could affect patient care. Patient navigators have increased utilization of medical and screening services, decreased anxiety associated with medical treatment, and increased patient satisfaction with services received. Populations who receive patient navigation services report fewer disruptions in care, and they're more likely to complete required treatment. So this is an excellent resource to use. So to summarize, there is considerable room for improvement to make clinical trials more ethnically and racially diverse. There has been some progress. In 2015, just 5% of clinical trial participants were African American, compared with 11% in 2018. And some companies are doing a good job, but we have a long way to go because of the huge variability in minority representation across trials, particularly in oncology. I hope you all agree that diversity in clinical trials is important for ethical, scientific, and financial reasons. We can't generalize results if we don't have representative populations in trials. We could be making health disparities by race and ethnicity worse if we're missing safety signals or not understanding how efficacy differs by race. Luckily, there are tangible steps that sponsors, CROs, and sites and investigators can take to increase diversity. Increasing diversity is not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. By planning for diversity at the beginning of study design and by intentionally building processes to strengthen patient trust and understanding, it will be easy to recruit the population with the disease and future populations for other indications. We need to raise awareness for everyone involved because we're all part of the solution. I'd like to leave you with a few resources that will be made available to you. The first is what's called the Racial Equity Impact Assessment Toolkit. This is something we use in our local school district here in North Carolina. It's a systematic examination of how different racial and ethnic groups will likely be affected by a proposed action. It's really one page of questions that you can ask yourself and your organization. It's used to minimize unanticipated adverse consequences and to reduce and prevent racial discrimination and inequities. I've also left you with some resources on patient navigation resources over here, a link to the FDA Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, and a link to the FDA's draft guidance on enhancing diversity in clinical trial populations. And then this is also a link of the paper that my colleague, Dr. Modell, and I recently published last month in Journal of Clinical Pharmacology that basically summarizes this talk. And that's called What Drug Development Sponsors, Contract Research Organizations, and Investigators Can Do to Increase Diversity in Clinical Trials. So thank you all for being here today, and we'd like to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. There's only so much we can learn by researching the literature, combing through FDA documents and news outlets, and reflecting on our own experiences. So we want to hear from you. What are your experiences increasing diversity in clinical trials? We want to learn from you. Let's work together to make our industry more equitable. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Yael. I'm sorry, we're both thanking you. This is Jack Modell. I just wanted, again, to say thank you. And to say to our audience, we haven't seen any questions come in yet. We know that this is a sensitive topic in some areas. Please be assured that we will not be keeping track of who asked what, nor will we say who asked what. And I would also encourage any of you who have a difference of opinion or want to challenge anything to please ask that question as well. So we have had a, sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead, sorry.
Okay, yeah, we have had one question has come in, and that is, what data do we have so far on how these efforts have enhanced recruitment of the minority populations here at Roe? I don't know that we have actual data. We have suggested this to several sponsors. The reception has been very positive. At first, we were a little bit concerned because we know that to recruit a diverse population requires a little more time, effort, and money, rather than just taking whoever comes in. But so far, I'd say 3 out of 4 sponsors recognize the importance of doing this and are willing to commit the resources, although there are a few who say timelines, 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 and we try to point out that when they go to FDA and have 90% Caucasian population for something that affects everybody, they're going to have to struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Michael, go ahead.
Thank you, Jack. Let's continue with the audience questions that we're getting. The next one is, how can we convince sponsors to give us the resources to increase diversity?
That's a great question. And I think there are many answers to that. One is focus on small steps, like a community trial engagement night, an educational night. That's something you can do, but also reminding sponsors that all of these ideas are part of good clinical practice anyway. We want everyone, every patient, to trust their providers, to trust the process. So this is what we should be doing, and the FDA says this is a priority for them. So if you're trying to get drugs approved, it's not dictated by law that you have to have a representative population, but the FDA can say, no, we won't. So it is worth it. It is an investment that we believe is worth it.
Okay. Do you think the FDA will enforce its guidance on diversity? Will there be quotas for each racial or ethnic group?
That's also a good question. I don't believe there will be quotas for each racial and ethnic group because we're not arguing for diversity's sake. We want the populations to reflect the indication population, who is actually going to be using the product, who has this disease. And again, even though FDA guidances are not legally binding, at Roe, we consider FDA guidance as the law. We know that we need to make FDA happy. And, 10 years ago, there weren't that many women participating in clinical trials. And the FDA came out with a draft guidance that became guidance on, increasing participation of women. And now it's more than 50% women. So we know that guidances can change behavior.
Thank you. Is it also possible that in how subjects are approached, as if they're called patients rather than subjects, does that make it more amenable to participation? That's
an interesting question. I had asked that same question when I first got to Roe because I come from a public health background where we don't use the term subjects. We use the term participants. I think in our regulatory field over here, it gets really confusing when you switch from patients to subjects because subjects are people who participate in a clinical trial. Patients might not necessarily be that. So, but I think you're right. The way that we reference, the way that we message this is important. And I think being as transparent as possible with the process will really help. gain that trust.
And I would just add, like anything, it's not so much an exact word that you use, but how you approach people, if they feel valued, if they feel like you understand their situation, if you're encouraging. So I can't imagine somebody would or wouldn't participate based only on whether you call them a patient or subject, but rather on how you made them feel in terms of the value of their contribution, that this would be a joint effort that hopefully would be mutually rewarding.
And my other answer to that is ask. Ask the patients participating in your clinical trial. What do they want to be referred to? It never hurts to ask.
Okay. Are the challenges as great concerning gender diversity in these clinical trials? Achieving
I'm sorry,
are the challenges as great in achieving gender diversity in these clinical trials?
So there is pretty good gender diversity. It's pretty split with women. I think it's like 52% are women. So that luckily has come a long way just in the past 10 years.
Great. Management also asks for return on investment information before adding more costs to, I guess, achieve some of these initiatives. How do you address this?
Good question, because the way you address things with management sometimes has to be kind of nuanced. Return on investment means that you get the label that you want so that the right drug gets to the right patient at the right time, and from a purely management standpoint, maybe that you maximize sales. If you're doing a study in a way that is not representative of the target population, the population to which you intend to market this, there is a good chance that FDA will say, 90% of your population was Caucasian. We don't have enough evidence in African American populations, Asian populations, et cetera, to allow labeling for these populations. And they could end up with a limited label, or a label that simply says we do not have adequate information, in these minority populations, which then restricts your ability to sell the drug. So it's not that big of an extra investment up front to get adequate representation so you can have the broadest possible label. And a lot of companies say, FDA would never do that based on what's happened in the past. But that's changing because we're all realizing, as Yael pointed out, the problems in not having adequate representation from people who will take the drug and may or may not have expected benefits and may or may not have side effects that you're aware of.
And I think also the field in general, more and more sponsors are paying attention to this. So I'm hoping that it'll be a big sea change where everyone just knows that it's worth it and they have to do it.
I see. Have sponsors considered creating more community events to involve and educate minority populations about research?
That's something that I'm hoping, and we're encouraging all of our sponsors to do that.
Yeah, we are, and I don't know exactly what a lot of sponsors are doing. I know some of the larger pharma companies typically do that routinely. We'll have events, community events, so that people understand, the risks and benefits of their products and their research. But that's a great way to bring patients or subjects, if you want to call them that, into clinical research studies by going out to the specific communities where you want to derive your patients from.
Right. One audience is asking if you have thoughts on the FDA making this guidance rather than a mandate, or what that status means.
Sure. So FDA guidances are not legally binding, but as I'm a regulatory writer, I follow the guidances like they are law because, the whole point of what we do is we try to present the evidence, summarize it, and package it in a way that FDA finds acceptable. And if they often will say, see our guidance, we will not accept this, see our guidance.
Yeah, and I'll point out the purpose, of course, is not just to make FDA happy. FDA is there actually for good reasons. They are trying, as I said, to get the right drug to the right patient at the right time, protect public health. And we look at them as our advocates in drug development. and working together, again, to give them what they need to make the best possible decisions. So another answer, too, to companies, by the way, saying, well, would you really have to do this? I would say to the company, do you really want to put your drug out there that you think is completely safe because you tested it on, 500 people and 90% were white, only to discover that because of genetic differences in minorities, that there's a very severe side effect that a small percentage of minorities might have that you didn't know about? I mean, one, it's bad science, it's not terribly ethical, but there are legal implications of doing that, of not testing it in the appropriate populations and only discovering when it's too late that there's something that you wish you had known and could have known if you had taken a little bit more time in drug development to get those populations.
I see. We still have a few more minutes. If anyone in the audience would like to submit more questions, please do so. I have at least one more here, and that is, are the challenges in getting this greater diversity in the clinical trials reflective of bias in how healthcare is provided overall?
Absolutely. I mean, just the fact that you really do need insurance to participate in a lot of these studies means that people of color are going to be left out, or many of them. So that's something that it would be great if everyone in this country had health insurance, or good health insurance, but that's just not the case right now. So in the meantime, we're really hoping that sponsors can step in and say, we will cover the cost of the scans. We will cover the cost of your transportation here.
Right. Very good. Can you quantify how some methods, that question just disappeared on me. Let me go to another one. Okay. How do you propose addressing barriers to clinical trials participation tied to cost? And the questioner gives an example here. If an oncology trial design incorporates standard of care treatment that is not covered by the sponsor, might uninsured or underinsured patients from more diverse groups not participate?
Absolutely, that's what's happening right now. They're not participating, and then they're missing out on the cutting edge science, and then we can't develop treatments that are targeted for those populations. So again, until everyone has good insurance, which let's not hold our breath for, it really is the onus on the sponsor to cover that, and I do believe it will be worth it in the end. And we do want to encourage people to send us questions by email, too, as you think of them, because I know this is a topic that it took me a long time to really wrap my head around.
And another question that comes up I think is worth addressing is, a sponsor may say, look, I've got 200 subjects in the study. Even if I have 10% Asians, which I believe is, 4 times or 5 times the background population, so it's an enriched population, that's still only 20, half on drug, half on placebo. That's not enough to have adequate power to really say what this drug is doing in that population. So why bother? Well, I'm okay with the first part, but the why bother is that you may not be the only one doing a study on this type of drug or this class of drug. So if 5 different sponsors each have an underpowered group of 20 people, FDA gets those data, so that in the end, FDA can compile the data across population subgroups, and they will have the power to look, the statistical power and the regulatory power, to actually look to see if the drug performs differently in the smaller population. So you don't necessarily have to have adequate power in every subgroup within your own studies. Obviously, that's ideal, but that's not always practical, but those data are still very useful in aggregate with what else is going on in the industry.
All right. Can you quantify how some methods have improved diversity?
How some methods have improved diversity. I mean, just the research methods to do market research, and understanding the terms patients use and understanding what they're looking for when you should approach a patient. I full-heartedly believe that using qualitative and quantitative methods to really understand the patient experience and the patient voice will get you far in increasing diversity.
All right. We have a lot more questions actually, and I'm trying to see for a moment if there's something that's a better follow-up, because some of these are very specific. But is there a variation at the state level as to what expenses are covered in a clinical trial, I guess, among different states in the country?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if that is publicly available, but I can look into that.
Okay. Sure, that's something I guess that could be followed up on.
Yes, please email me.
Okay. And that, if you send that into your email address is here. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Moving on, are there any efforts to implement community-based participatory research as a method for recruitment?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? You were cutting out.
Oh, sorry. Are there any efforts to implement community-based participatory research as a method for recruitment? I guess recruitment.
I mean, we're trying to do that at Roe, you know, in talks with our sponsors of really finding out the patient voice. But that is something that we recommend to our sponsors when they ask us what we could do, you know.
Right. We try to do it. There are universities that do that in general to increase their pool of research subjects for all their studies, and sponsors are interested in doing this.
We encourage it.
Okay. Are you familiar with the EDICT project, eliminating disparities in clinical trials? If you're familiar with that, or if it needs explanation, perhaps you can provide an explanation for the audience.
I am not familiar with that, but I will look that up.
Okay.
Thank you, whoever asked that.
All right. And we're, I guess, moving on. We have time for one more question. This is going to be the final question. So does the FDA publish or make available to sponsors how their trials compare to other sponsors' trials or to the overall therapeutic areas regarding diversity?
Yeah, so you can look up FDA snapshot, and it's by year since 2015, and you can see each drug name and the sponsor, and you can see how. I mean, I showed you some snapshots from that. That's publicly available with a quick Google search, so you can see it.
Very good. I hope that's helpful for everybody, and. Thank you, Yael, and thanks, Jack. And thank you to all our audience for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. It made the discussion very lively. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you at future events.